Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always for the GSMC Sports Network. Now, before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you, as always, that if you feel so inclined throughout the duration of our show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, as well as our website, gsmcspodcast.net, on our ticker down below here, to better leave opinions, feedback, or input you might have about the show as well, so that I can interact with you, our faithful audience, and those around the network too. I think it's genuinely appreciated by all concerned, no matter what you do for our network, because it just makes our shows that much more lively, that much more interactive, and overall that much better as well. But without further ado, let's jump right into our NHL Power Rankings for this week. A couple of changes here, a couple of teams moving up, a couple of teams maybe moving out, a couple of teams standing pat, but overall, been a very exciting season. A lot of unexpected surprises potentially at the top of these rankings, but also a couple of true Stanley Cup contenders staying pat, staying in the mixture. A couple of teams potentially lurking in the background, the Carolina Hurricanes potentially, after that Mikko Rantanen blockbuster trade, becoming a true Stanley Cup contender and in good form as well. But for right now, this top five is what you have for this week. And without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting off at number 5, a team definitely in form, picked up its third win in a row in dramatic fashion over another team on this list, a team that's floundering for that matter, but this team certainly is not, and I love how they profile, especially for the postseason, the Dallas Stars. And I really, really love the balance of this team, specifically the youth in this team, but also the depth in this team, the experience they have. Jake Ottinger is a very underrated goaltender, one of the top 5 goaltenders in every statistical category. They have a lot of talent in their youth. Wyatt Johnston, Tyler Harley, an incredible player as well, but also a lot of veterans, Jamie Benn, Miro Heiskanen, who unfortunately, the only caveat in that dramatic win over Vegas a couple of days ago was him going down, but still they have a lot of depth around him. And not only was that win against Vegas after they rallied from 3-1 down to win it on a Wyatt Johnston overtime goal, their third win in a row is their 4th in 5. They're currently 32-12, and I did not necessarily write down their overtime loss record, but they're a hot team in the West. They're gaining ground, and I feel like no one will want to face this team this time around in, say, a conference semifinal round, because last year Oilers were really hot and the Stars kind of ran out of steam at a bad time. But this time around, I feel like the Stars can win a rematch, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about Edmonton when they're ranked. But ultimately, the Dallas Stars, a pretty incredible team with a lot of incredible depth, and I would not be surprised to see them make a deep postseason run this year and potentially lift the Stanley Cup trophy. And then at number 4, let's talk about their ultimate rivals out west, maybe their biggest rival in terms of getting to the Stanley Cup as the Western Conference representative at this moment in time, as they have gained ground in Vegas in the Pacific Division, the Edmonton Oilers. And the most impressive thing about the Oilers is that they win in regulation a lot. I've seen them do this many a time as an Edmonton Oilers fan. They garner all these regulation wins, and it's truly impressive how many times they either win or lose regulation. They don't have many overtime losses this year or wins at 5 overtime wins and losses, but ultimately they are tied for first since January 1st in terms of 10 regulation wins to date. But what most impressive is that once that star you see on our screen went down with a suspension, Connor McDavid, they went 2-1-0 without him. That goes to show that they have a little bit more depth to counter all these very loaded, top-heavy Western Conference teams as well. I just feel like a lot of things, though, need to click yet again once they get to the postseason, what they did last year when their defense really shored up. Knobloch was very creative with his line with his lines, but ultimately this Edmonton Oilers team is scary when all of their stars are clicking. Leon Draisaitl, the leading point scorer in the league right now. Connor McDavid getting on a bit of a roll, getting on a bit of a goal streak yet again. And when Zach Hyman's good and going. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, the longest tenured Edmonton Oiler. And then this young defense with a guy like Evan Bouchard, who can contribute on both sides very, very well. I feel like this Edmonton team is primed and ready to make another Stanley Cup run. In a couple of weeks, potentially could be the number one team in my rankings. Right now, they're on pace for 115 points, which would match the Toronto Maple Leafs 2020 point total as the highest for a Canadian team in this decade. So, right now, the Edmonton Oilers are pretty hot. Like I said before, they gained ground on Vegas to the point where they've overtaken them in the Pacific Division standings and could see a historic point total for yet another Canadian team this decade. So ultimately, the Oilers are one of the surging teams, not just in the West, but in the entire NHL, and I would not be surprised to see them sit atop these rankings in a couple weeks' time. So congratulations to them, and I think that they really can kick into second gear here on the stretch. They don't have many intimidating games. They do play the Maple Leafs in a couple of weeks, a Canada on Canada showdown. That's a big rivalry, but ultimately, they are playing well within themselves on their own streak, winning in regulation in dramatic fashion. But ultimately, I feel like they have what it takes, yet again, to make magic happen down the stretch. Then let's go to our number 3 team. A lot of people may be mad about their placement on this list, especially seeing as to how they've had a very rough stretch over the past couple of weeks that kind of came to a head against Dallas a couple of days ago, that we already talked about. The Las Vegas Golden Knights. They're currently on a 2-4-2 stretch. They lost momentum in the Pacific Division, and in dramatic fashion, like I continuously say, lost to Dallas Tuesday night in overtime in a painful manner. And I feel like this Vegas Golden Knights team is still one that warrants a placement in the top 5, but I could see how a lot of people are starting to lose a little bit of faith in them. It's mainly because of the goaltending struggles. Adin Hill and Ilya Samsonov are not the best in terms of battery mates between the sticks in the hockey world. And I do feel like when this team is clicking from top to bottom, from the blue line to your centers, I feel like this is one of the best teams in the NHL still. They still have a team identity, much like what we saw out of them 2 years ago, much like what you saw out of the Panthers last year, and I really like how they profile going into the postseason. Right now, they're in a tough stretch, but I really like all the players on this team. And yes, the goaltending issues are going to have to be figured out and addressed eventually. But for now, this is still a team that can get on a roll. Remember, just this time last week, another team in our rankings, the Winnipeg Jets, were going through a rough stretch. I still had them in number 2, and they've gotten out of it. And they have a chance to prove themselves in a couple of days against Washington. So why can't the Vegas Golden Knights do the same thing? In that, go through a rough patch and then come out on the other side better than ever. And this is a team very well equipped to do just that. So I wouldn't be too worried if I'm a Vegas Golden Knights fan, but I am worried about positioning in the Western Conference standings should Edmonton continue their role and your rough patch continues. Because Edmonton's momentum could see, seeding-wise, the Vegas Golden Knights face a hotter team. Say like a Winnipeg. Say like a Minnesota or something. So I eventually want to see this Vegas Golden Knights get out of this better on the other side, because you don't want to drop too far down the Western Conference standings. But ultimately, I still think they warrant a spot in the top 5 this week, no matter where you think they should be. But let's get into number 2. Let's talk about Winnipeg's resurgence after their own weird switch at the number 2 spot. They have 8 wins in 11. They got a 4-1 win over Montreal Tuesday, and now they are tied with Washington in terms of overall points in the NHL. Obviously, both of them play in different conferences, but still, very impressive season from the Jets. Have perhaps the best goaltender of anyone on this list in Connor Hellebuyck. Main reason, guys like Mark Scheifele, Kyle Connor, Blake Wheeler still plying their trade with this team. And like I said, I think our own sports writer Matt Quinn put it best in one of his articles when he described the Winnipeg Jets. They are the San Antonio Spurs in the Greg Popovich era of the NHL this time around. They just slowly go about their business by playing fundamental hockey. It's not necessarily the sexiest, but it gets the job done. And when you have a goaltender like Connor Hellebuyck, who was one of the fastest goaltenders to 300 wins, you can have a guy who's like that between the sticks, then you're as good as gold and you deserve to be where you are. So kudos to them, even though going into the season they were maybe seen as a dark horse contender in the Western Conference. They have emerged as one of the top contenders in the Western Conference. Definitely going to be a struggle in that very loaded Western Conference playoff field, but I think that this Jets team are undaunted just because of who's between the pipes. But they're going up against, in 2 days' time, the number one team in this ranking with another fantastic goaltender to discuss. And I think it's going to be a great game that will test both of these teams' depth and experience. But ultimately, the Winnipeg Jets, number 2, haven't yet usurped the number 1 team. And that is the Washington Capitals. We can talk all we want about Ovechkin continuing to impress in his age 41 season, I believe. We can talk about the physicality of this defense. Tom Wilson still plying his trade, pairing very well with guys like John Carlson and younger defensemen as well. But I want to talk about the rise of, like I said, an unsung goaltender, very underrated in terms of his move from Vegas to Washington, and that is, of course, Mr. Logan Thompson. This season, he is second in goals against average, first in save percentage at .927, and he really has led to the resurgence of this team. It's not just the sum of its parts in the defense and their physicality. It's Logan Thompson between the pipes as well. And it's going to be a fascinating goalie showdown when both Winnipeg and Washington face off against each other in a matter of days. And I really think that could determine the number 1 ranking next week as well. But let me know what you think about this week's rankings. I know a lot of skepticism could be surrounding my Vegas Golden Knights positioning. Maybe seeing as to how hotter teams are looking behind teams like the Stars and Oilers, why not them? But ultimately, I think this top 5 is very fascinating. But coming next, we view a little bit belatedly the all-college football playoff team, specifically on the offensive side of the football. So stick around to see if your favorite stars from the playoff made this list after the break.